Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to this panel on the power of creative destruction. I'm John Fernald, a professor of economics at INSEAD. I'll be moderating today's panel discussion. So let me now introduce our three panelists. So first, Philippe Aghion is a chaired professor of economics at INSEAD, as well as being a professor at the Collège de France. Before joining INSEAD, he was a professor at Harvard and at the London School of Economics. Philippe is one of the most celebrated, cited, and prominent economists in the world. His research is broad, with a particular focus on economic growth. I note that last summer, there was a Festschrift in his honor, conference celebrating his work, and a number of Nobel Prize winners who were participating discussed the influence that Philippe had on their work. He is the author, along with Céline, Antonin, and Simon Bunel, of a recent book on the power of creative destruction. That book is the reason for today's webinar. In addition to Philippe, our two panelists have considerable real-world and policy experience that bear on the themes of creative destruction. Ayhan Kose is the chief economist and director of the Prospects Group in the Equitable Growth, Finance, and Institutions Practice Group of the World Bank. He leads the bank's work on the global macroeconomic outlook, financial flows, and commodity markets. He's also a prolific researcher on international macroeconomics and finance. His latest book is on global waves of debt. Ayhan has an undergraduate degree from Bill Kent University in Turkey and a PhD in economics from the University of Iowa. I would note that Ayhan has taught macroeconomics in the global economy multiple times at INSEAD over the years. Catherine Mann is currently a member of the Monetary Policy Committee for the Bank of England. Catherine has held a range of senior positions in academia, policy institutions, and the private sector. Until this summer, she was the global chief economist at Citibank. Prior to that, she was chief economist and G20 finance deputy at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. Catherine has authored or co-authored 7 books, 60+ articles, and numerous shorter pieces and testimony. She has an undergraduate degree from Harvard and a PhD in economics from MIT. Our plan for the next 57 minutes is as follows. Philippe will open with 15 or so minutes talking about his book, The Power of Creative Destruction. Then Ayhan and Catherine will make remarks of 5 to 7 minutes. Our remaining time will be more interactive, including responding to questions from the audience. So now, without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Philippe to discuss the power of creative destruction.
Thank you very much, John. You are way too generous in your introduction, so I can only disappoint. Thank you so much. This is a joint book with Céline Antonin, who is a researcher at Sciences Po, OFCE, and with me at Collège de France, and Simon Bunel, who is a researcher at INSEAD, Banque de France, and with me at Collège de France. So, oh my God, I tried to pass the slide, and now I don't know why it's not, oh la la.
Well, we can see them.
You can see them. Yeah, okay, I do like this. Okay, from beginning, I try to make sure that I can pass. Voila, here it goes. Okay, so creative destruction is the process. It's a concept introduced by Schumpeter to refer to the fact that new innovations displace old technologies. So the new replaces the old. They make old technologies obsolete. So what we did with Peter Howitt and I in 1987 at MIT, where Catherine got her PhD, we developed, I was first year assistant professor and Peter was visiting for 1 year from Western Ontario. And that year we developed a paradigm where we embodied creative destruction. So the paradigm has 3 main ideas: long-run growth driven by cumulative process of innovation. Each innovator builds on the giant shoulders of his or her predecessors. Second, innovations result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of innovation rents. And 3, creative destruction, new innovations displace old technologies. And you can see right away there is a contradiction at the heart of the growth process. On the one hand, you need monopoly rents to motivate innovators, to motivate entrepreneurs. But on the other hand, they are very tempted to use those rents once they innovate to prevent subsequent innovation, subsequent entry. And regulating capitalism, it's about this contradiction. And the whole book is about this contradiction. Whether you talk about inequality, secular stagnation, middle income trap, green innovation, explaining the takeoff, you are always up against this contradiction, okay? Now what we do in this book is to use the notion of creative destruction and the paradigm, the Aghion paradigm, to do three main things. One, the first is to revisit some main enigmas in economic history. Second is to question common wisdoms. And the third is to rethink the future of capitalism. So I go very quickly on historical enigma. One big enigma is the industrial takeoff. Industrial takeoff, you know, that's Madison from OECD, where Catherine, you know, was chief economist. And there he showed us long series on GDP per capita worldwide. He inferred what it was because, of course, you had to use information on urbanization, on many kinds of information to reconstitute, you know, what GDP per capita could have been worldwide, going very far back. And you see that growth is a very recent phenomenon. The takeoff is 1820. Starts in England, then France, and then you know, other parts, other countries, and then US. But you see, it's growth as we know it is only 200 years old. Question is why in Europe and why that late? And there, the Joe Mokyr, M-O-K-Y-R, we all know, tells you the story, and it's in chapter 2 of the book. But it very much maps the Superheroine paradigm that Howitt and I, you know, designed. The first thing is that you had institutions for cumulative innovation in Europe. For example, the encyclopedia, the British encyclopedia and the French encyclopedia with Diderot, that made it possible to codify knowledge and to have cumulative innovation. And more generally, you had an open society of science that was there, that had developed. Okay, that's number one. Number two, you had institutions to protect property rights on innovation, so that indeed, when you innovate, you could get grants from innovation. That was made possible in the US, in England, by the Glorious Revolution, in France, by the French Revolution, followed by Bonaparte. That led to institutions that protect property rights on innovation. And the third one is creative destruction. In China, whenever you would have inventors, and you had inventions in China, very important, going very far back, inventors would be persecuted by the emperor, would be very concerned that the inventor could threaten his power. Whereas in Europe, if you would persecute an inventor in France, the inventor could go to England, could flee to, you know, Switzerland or Prussia, and could innovate there. And that's the competition among European countries made it possible to sustain creative destruction. So you see how much the paradigm helps understand the takeoff. Another enigma is industrial, is the secular stagnation. Growth has gone down, you know, GDP growth since the mid-2000s after going up. But particularly true in IT producing sectors, in IT using sector. And there in chapter 6, we explain very much that what happened with the IT revolution, you know, the big superstar firms, the GAFAM, we call them in France, Google, Amazon, Walmart, Microsoft, etc. They could expand, they had better social capital. When they expanded initially, that boosted growth in the US. But then once they expanded everywhere, it inhibited entry and innovation by non-superstar firms. And you can see that entry of new firms also goes down. You can see that's the rate and rise and decline in employment-weighted plant entry rate. And you see that there is a fall in entry rate exactly when you have the fall in measured TFP growth. Okay, so that's interesting. It's again the phenomenon that yesterday's innovator block new innovations. Alors, inequality is another one. I don't have much time to talk about inequality here. Let me talk about the second part, which is questioning common wisdoms. The book questions common wisdoms. A wisdom that he questions is that taxing robot protects employment. Okay, so I have some colleagues at MIT and elsewhere who thinks that, you know, automation destroys employment mainly, and they advocate taxing robots, although they are changing recently. The work that I've done recently with my co-authors in the book, Céline, Antonin, Simon Bunel, and also Xavier Jarabel, who won the best French economist last year, is to say, well, if you look at French firms, when they automate, they create employment. Alors that might be surprising. How come? Because when they automate, they replace manpower by machines. How come they destroy employment? Because you see, you have a productivity effect. When you automate, your export price goes down, and more generally, your quality adjusted price goes down because you become more productive. Because you become more productive, your export price in particular goes down. And because of that, you see your sales go up. because you have a market size that increases, so you have a bigger market for your product, and therefore you demand more employment yourself, and that productivity effect more than counteracts the substitution effect of manpower by machines. And therefore, taxing robots is a very bad idea because you would prevent firms from innovating and therefore becoming more productive and therefore creating employment. You see, so that's another idea which we question. Then, so that is chapter 3 of the book. Chapter 13 of the book, we talk about protectionism. Protectionism is not the way to regain control of value chain. Here you can see, for example, Germany it has much better control on value chain than France, not because they put tariffs, but because Germany innovated and invested. And that we discussed in chapter 13. What would be the pitfalls of trying to regain control of value chains through protectionism? So the third thing that the book does is to help us rethink capitalism. COVID was a revelator. It revealed a broken social of capitalism, of the failures, of the defects of capitalism in various countries. In US, the COVID revealed a broken social model. In Europe, it revealed an inadequate innovation ecosystem. So here is the US and Germany. So the gray curves are US, the black curves are Germany. The triangles are unemployment rates, and the circles are the share of population without health insurance. And you can see that, you know, you can see Obamacare was great. Huh? With Obamacare, you have a fall in the fraction of US population without health insurance. So thanks, Obama. But on the other hand, you see that with COVID, because people lost employment, when you lose your employment in US, you are likely, especially if you are at the bottom of the distribution, to lose, proper health insurance. And you can see that the fraction of the non-insured in the US goes up. And whereas in Germany, you see everybody has health insurance throughout. And I could have put, I put Germany here, I could have put France or the Scandinavians or, most Western European countries. It would be like similar to Germany versus US. And similarly, if I look at the rate of poverty, the risk of falling into poverty, you see that, it increases in the US, that's the gray circles. It increases in the US with COVID, whereas it remains flat in Germany throughout COVID. So you see, US is not a good social model. On the other hand, US is a much better innovation model than Europe. If you look here at the number of biotech patents per million inhabitants and look at the 2016 column, you see that US is way above the average of EU 27 or the average OECD, etc. And if I showed instead the top cited patents, then the discrepancy would be even bigger. The dominance of US would be even sharper if I restricted attention to top cited patents. So why is that? It's because you see, when it comes, if only for biotech, the US, they have a fantastic ecosystem. For basic research, they have the National Science Foundation, which is very well endowed. They have the National Institute of Health. They have the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is a sponsors organization that finances a lot of basic research in biotech. In addition, they have venture capital much more developed than in Europe. They have institutional investors much more developed than in Europe. And they have the BARDA, the Biologic Advanced Research Development, the Biologic Advanced Research, Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority. And the BARDA, it's like the DARPA. They created the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, in the 50s because they were racing with the Soviet Union on defense and space. This kind of organism, it's when you have a basic research done and you want to turn it into applications with a clear mission quickly. There, it's very important to have something like DARPA or BARDA. The money comes from the government. The government names team leaders, and the team leaders can freely elicit competing projects, make public-private partnerships to achieve the mission. So, for example, Gagarin from Soviet Union, man in space, Gagarin, the US had to put someone in space in 2 years. DARPA, or you need to make very concrete progress on defense, DARPA. And BARDA is the same as DARPA for biotech. We had the ARN messenger technology. You needed to convert it quickly into vaccines, into mass production of vaccines using the technology of ARN messenger. BARDA was great for that. And the US spends $12 billion on COVID-related vaccine and treatments in BARDA. Europe spent a total of $4 billion if you add EIB and the European Commission. So much less than BARDA. So you see that they have a fantastic ecosystem in the US. So now, what is the capitalism that I would like? I would like a capitalism that combines the good side of the American model, innovative, with the good side of the European model, protective. Some people believe that it's one or the other, that if you choose to be innovative, it has to be at the expense of protection and inclusion. And if you choose to be protective and inclusive, it has to be at the expense of innovation. I disagree sharply with that view, sharply. I believe there are three types of policies that can make you both more innovative and more inclusive, protective. The first one is flex security. In the US, Case and Deaton, that's from Case and Deaton, that's chapter 11 of my book, of our book, we show that, that's the mortality of white non-Hispanics uneducated between 50-54 age 50-54. And you can see that the mortality, that's the continuous black curve, goes up in that category since 2000. And it's very much linked to the fear of losing employment, because when you lose employment, as I mentioned, you might lose at least partly health insurance, you lose status, you lose income, your family may disintegrate, many bad things happen to you. Hence, when you have the fear of unemployment, makes you take opioids, makes you take sleeping pills, makes you eat and become obese, and hence the mortality. In Denmark, my friend Alexandra Roulet, colleague of ours from INSEAD, done very important work showing that in Denmark, when you become unemployed, it has zero negative effect on health. So she compares the health of someone whose enterprise closes between 2001 2006 to someone identical in experience, in age, in education, but employed in a firm that does not close during the same period. No effect of becoming unemployed on the probability to purchase antidepressants, anti-anxiety or sleeping pills. No effect on the probability to visit hospital for disease or circulatory system, for problem of circulation, and no effect on mortality. So there is a very good system. What did they do in Denmark? When you become unemployed for 2 years, you get 90% of your salary, you get retrained, and the state helps you find a new job. And of course, you have to accept at least the second job that's offered to you, otherwise you lose your insurance. But that system not only makes creative destruction work much better, but and so more innovative Denmark, following when they put this flex security in place, but at the same time, it makes growth more protective. You see, so here is an example of that you can both make growth more innovative, the economy more innovative and more protective. The second one is education. I'm almost finished. This shows the probability of inventing as a function of the parental income. So the left-hand side curve is based on current US data by Bell, Shetty, Jaravel, Petkova, and Van Reenen, QJE 2019. The middle one is based on work by Aksigit, Bridgely, Nicholas on historical US data. And the right-hand curve is by work that I've done with Ufuk Aksigit, Harry Aitinen, and Otto Toivonen on Finnish data. But you see, everywhere, having a father or mother with high income makes you much more likely to innovate. Alors, it's true also in Finland, where education is totally free. And why is that? It's because more educated parents, they have more knowledge and they are more awareness of what you could do. So they transmit to their children not only human capital, but also aspirations. And you see, for example, on the Finnish data, when I control for parental education, you see the curve goes from being the blue curve into becoming the red curve, much less, it becomes much flatter. And so this means that if you invest in education for many generations and in an education system of good quality that gives you both, that makes sure that even if you are born to a poor family, you still get essentially the same knowledge and the access to information about what can be done, aspirations, then we will have less what I call lost Einsteins. You have many in our economies lost Einsteins, as Bell et al. Say. Many people who are very smart, but they are born to poor families, and the parents didn't tell them what could be done. So they failed to be inventors. Suddenly, suppose we invest in a very good education system that makes everybody, access innovation, we will have less lost Einsteins, more innovation, and of course, more growth, inclusive growth. And the last policy is competition. I told you before, the main reason for the decline in growth in the US is the fact that you have these big superstar firms that inhibit entries. Now, suppose you have new competition policy, better competition policy, you regulate merger and acquisition, maybe you do some breakups, maybe you do some data sharing that you force. It's a bit what Biden is trying to do, by the way. Yeah? The recent reforms on competition by Biden go in the right direction. Then if you do that, you will have more entry, more innovation, and by definition, growth will be more inclusive, because we show also in the book, chapter 5, that when you have more entrant innovation, social mobility goes up. And so you make growth more inclusive, but you also make more innovative economy. So you see, that's what I want to finish up. The key to a successful capitalism is the triangle between firms, what I call marché here, markets, the state that regulates, for example, competition and things like that, but civil society is also important. You needed voters, you know, in the US to bring Biden about. I mean, without civil society, we would not be there. Also, the constitution is the same in France and in Colombia, but you know, civil society is not the same. That's why the reality is very different between France and Colombia. And there is another example: is the civil rights, the US civil rights. You know, following the Civil War, you know, there was the 15th Amendment in the US Constitution, making it, you know, possible for the African American to vote. But as you know, the southern states in the US had this literacy test and poll tax that would make it impossible for African American to vote. And it took the civil rights movement for, in 1965, finally, the Supreme Court had a ruling that would make it, that would prohibit this literacy test and make it really possible for African American to vote. So you needed this triangle: firms, state, civil society. And that's very important. Schumpeter was very pessimistic, my last word. Schumpeter was very pessimistic about capitalism because he thought that the first innovators would turn into entrenched conglomerates that would prevent any subsequent innovation. To some extent, the Montesquieu can help you, because even if they buy out the executive power, to some extent, the executive power is controlled by the judiciary, and to some extent, the judiciary can do something. But that's not enough, because the Constitution is an incomplete contract, as we explained in chapter 15, and that's where civil society is important to really enforce the incomplete contract, the constitutional contract. That's why this triangle is so key. So my response: Schumpeter was a pessimist. I am a Gramscian optimist. I believe in a fighting optimism, in the optimism of the will. It's not that things will happen automatically, but there are forces that can make, avert the pessimistic prediction that Schumpeter had about capitalism, and very much revolving around this triangle. So I think I should stop there. Thank you very much. I've taken 20 minutes instead of 15, but I already thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Philippe, for that sweeping analysis and ending on a note of optimism. So we'll probably return to that in the discussion period. So let me now turn the floor over to Ayhan Kose from the World Bank.
Thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to join this very distinguished panel. I'm very lucky. I took courses from Philippe when he visited the IMF Institute multiple times and learned growth from him. And I would like to congratulate Philippe, Céline, and Simon for this really fascinating contribution. As Philippe just did, it covers a very large ground, but it does it in a very, very serious way. It provides theoretical arguments, empirical evidence, and historical examples. And this is the type of book we need, given the enormous growth challenge the global economy is facing. The type of challenge me, my colleagues have to deal with at the bank every single day and help policymakers. There is a lot of hope about future growth, and like Philippe, I am also optimistic. The question is that whether we see that type of hope in the data, and that brings the kind of the ultimate issue back to Philippe's book, how we can have the type of environment that will promote growth. So I will make three observations. Some of them are emerging market developing economies, and link these observations to the importance of implementing types of policies Philippe and his co-authors basically favor to promote economic growth. So let me share my presentation here. I'm hoping you can all see the presentation.
We can,
So,
it's great.
Yeah. So the first observation, there is a very serious growth challenge around the world when we look at emerging market and developing economies. This graph shows you the relative per capita income growth, the income per capita income growth in a certain region. There are 6 regions here, the World Bank regions, and growth in advanced economies, the difference between the two. What you want to see, you want here all positive numbers, and it is true for East Asia, it's true for South Asia. Growth, per capita income growth in these regions higher than the per capita income growth in advanced economies. So their income converging to advanced economies growth. This is true prior to the pandemic. You see this 2010-19, as well as during the, the kind of what we have next 3 years, 21 to 23. And then you go to Latin America and the Caribbean, this LAC, Middle East, North Africa, the MNA, and Sub-Saharan Africa, SSA. And what you see there, prior to the pandemic, these regions were basically becoming poorer relative to advanced economies. And now after the pandemic, that growth gap is even larger. So many developing economies are not converging in terms of their per capita incomes. They are in fact divergent. So related to this growth observation, the lack of growth, there is this issue of slowing growth, and that growth slowdown is everywhere. One way to think about the slowdown is to basically think about what's going on with potential growth, the growth an economy can produce when it fully utilizes its resources and technology. Philippe might say, hold on, this is a neoclassical idea, not a Schumpeterian idea, but it has a very simple message to convey about the slowdown in growth, and that's a very, I think, powerful message. What we know already over the past decade, all fundamental drivers of growth, investment, productivity growth, improvements in education and health, working age population growth had slowed. So these trends were expected to continue over the 2020s. Even if we did not have pandemic, global growth and the growth in emerging market developing economies, here you see EMDEs, were expected to slow between the 2010s and the 2020s. So the potential growth slowdown we expected in emerging market developing economies was around 1 percentage point from 2010s to 2020s, from around basically 5% to 4%. But as a result of the disruption caused by the pandemic, that disruption took place in the case of investment, in the case of education, in the case of labor market, these slowdowns in growth are now likely to be another 0.6 percentage points steeper in the case of emerging market developing economies, as well as, of course, at the global level. Okay, you might say, you know what, I don't believe these estimates, the econometric estimates, and I don't believe the concept of potential growth. Then you can look at the forecasters, long-term growth forecasts. These are the forecasts, private forecasters. And you see basically how the 10-year ahead output growth forecast evolved over time. For advanced economies, forecasters expected 10-year ahead growth to be around basically 3% in 2000. It declined to 2% in 2010, and then nowadays around 1.5%. So in 2 decades, long-term growth expectations basically declined from 3% to 1.5%. So people have become increasingly more pessimistic about the ability of advanced economies to generate growth. For emerging market developing economies, there was a little bit of optimism in the 2000s, but in 2010s, growth expectations were become increasingly more pessimistic. In fact, they went down from more than 6% now to less than 4%. With the pandemic, there are challenges and opportunities. And that brings to my second observation. So we can push growth, think about innovation. There's a big challenge. You are already spending quite a bit of money, resources to deal with the health crisis. There could be much lower research and development spending that could affect the technological progress. But there are at the same time opportunities. Societies are adopting technologies much faster that could basically give a boost to research and development. When you think about education and human capital, we know that pandemic had lasting adverse impacts on education and human capital accumulation because of school closures, as well as, of course, the job losses Philippe already mentioned. But at the same time, there is this opportunity, the lower opportunity cost of learning and human capital accumulation, expanded access to online teaching and learning. And all of these, of course, could translate into faster growth if we can implement policies and take advantage of the type of policies Philippe and his colleagues have been pushing forward. Finally, whether the reforms, the type of reforms, when we think about legal system, when we think about the education system, when we think about overall institutions, whether these translate into better growth outcomes, better growth expectations. So in the bank, we conducted an exercise looking at what happened to growth expectations 5 years after reforms employed or reforms stalled. As you see here, the bottom line is that investors have recognized the reforms. For example, 5 years after reforms that improved investment profiles, bureaucratic quality, improve the control of corruption and the law and order, these 10-year ahead growth prospects, I mentioned the forecast increased. But when there were setbacks in reforms, the growth expectations basically have gotten worse. In a nutshell, the book, I think, is a treasure chest of policy interventions to create the environment to foster growth, promote growth, and it talks about the important role of the state, but it defines the limits of that. Philippe showed this magic triangle, firms, society, and state, and how they can work together to improve the growth prospects. I talked about the pessimism in the data, but I'm quite optimistic like Philippe. If policymakers take advantage of the type of ideas Philippe and his colleagues are pushing forward, we might be able to see better growth going forward. So let me stop there, John. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Ayhan. And now let me turn the floor to Catherine Mann.
Well, hello. It's really a challenge, an opportunity to be here with Philippe and Ayhan. It's been a while, but it's a real pleasure. This book really is has already been described by Ayhan in such great words, but it's holistic, and I think that is the essential word to identify the challenges that we face in order to turn those somewhat pessimistic comments from Ayhan. He's optimistic, but the data are sort of pessimistic. So what can we do that is holistic in order to get us to the positive and optimistic outcomes. I also am optimistic. I have spent a lot of time in policy, doing policy advising, particularly at the OECD. And the challenges that are put forward in this book, the challenges for policy, are not new. And so the question is, how can we marshal even more evidence? And there's a tremendous amount in this book. How can we marshal even more evidence to support policy endeavors that will get us to the optimistic outcome, as opposed to staying on the track that we have been on, which is one towards slower growth. So what I'd like to do is just walk you through a couple of slides that also shows evidence, but also I think sets out some of the policy challenges, which we'll cover a little bit more in the Q&A time. So we'll do the slide share story. So I set out this challenge as creative destruction and the productivity, globalization, and inequality nexus. It also identifies a triangle between productivity, globalization, and inequality. And we can talk about how creative destruction acts on each one of these three elements. So the first piece of the nexus is on productivity. So there's productivity destruction at the frontier, but there's a divergence. And what I'd like to show here is some work that was done by several of my teams at the OECD, Chiara Criscuolo and Dan Andrews. And this is firm level data, and it shows labor productivity for frontier firms, the top 5% of firms in each sector. Okay, so it's not just about the superstar IT firms that we often hear about. There's productivity growth, dramatic, starting in the 2000s, in these frontier firms, as I say, the top 5% in each sector. But those firms, and they're not always the same firms, it's the top 5 firms. There is some juggling and jostling for position there, but collectively, there is a slowdown at the frontier of these firms. And so that's one of the challenges for creative destruction. The slowdown in productivity growth is partly about the slowdown at the frontier, as I say, not just the superstars, but the entire frontier in each sector. But there is another challenge for creative destruction to address, and that is the failure for really to see any productivity growth at the 95% of the other firms. Again, this is in each sector. Basically, there's a bottom, a very large bottom of the distribution where we're not seeing any productivity growth at all. So there is a challenge to motivate and affect the gains from creative destruction at these non-frontier firms. So it's a double-barrel challenge that we have to address: the slowdown at the frontier, but also the fact that the majority of firms, the vast majority of firms, have not seen any productivity growth or almost no productivity growth. The one piece that I would like to perhaps tee up here is, what does the role of the financial sector play in these two creative destruction challenges? So the second leg of the triangle is about the globalization part. There's stalled globalization, stalled global engagement, and that has implications for productivity growth. The right-hand slide shows the relationship, the upward sloping relationship, the positive relationship between exports, value-added exports, and productivity growth. There's variation amongst countries, as you can see by the dots, but it's very clear that there is a positive relationship between globalization, global engagement through the export channel, and productivity growth. What do we see on the left-hand side, however, is that global engagement has stalled. Now, this particular picture is exports plus imports as a share of GDP. There are other measures that we could be looking at, but that you can see that there is a slowdown, or really a stalling, of globalization, global engagement. And this has implications because, of course, global markets are a discipline. They are an opportunity, and they are a pressure for gaining both this innovation challenge, but also innovation inflows. So global engagement is an essential component of creative destruction, and it is something that we have seen slow down. We can talk about in the Q&A, again, teeing up some questions about what is it about policy that would engage deeper globalization in order to enhance this essential ingredient to productivity growth. The third element of the triangle is inequality. Productivity growth dynamics are related to inequality, but perhaps not in the way that some people think. Often people think that productivity growth is negative for inequality. These challenges of transformation have negative consequences for inequality. But I would like to put forward a slightly different view, which is that productivity growth creates the opportunity for increased gains that are widely shared. So where are we now with this set of inequalities? So the right-hand panel looks like something you've already seen. This is the frontier firm analysis. Rather than looking at it through the lens of productivity growth, this chart is the lens of real compensation per worker. And so what we're seeing here is that the frontier firms pay more, a lot more. And there has been some increase in the compensation per worker from the frontier firms. So we would like to have more firms at the frontier or working at that high productivity growth rate in order to support higher wages. We also see the consequences, however, of this 95%, the real bulk of firms that have low productivity growth. Well, they don't pay well. And so we should not want to have firms in that bucket, that very big bucket. We want to engage more firms to have higher productivity growth, the transformation associated with creative destruction, so as to have the wherewithal to pay workers better. There's another way of looking at inequalities, and this is something that Philippe noted in his opening remarks, the lost Einsteins of the world. So a slightly different way of showing this challenge, and also the challenges associated with overall slow globalization, stalled globalization and stalled productivity growth, is to look at intergenerational income. The left-hand panel shows in each line a birth cohort and the lifetime earnings over for each birth cohort. So the earnings on the vertical axis and the lifetime of each birth cohort on the horizontal. So in the 1940s, which is the lowest line, the dark blue, the birth cohort that for the 1940s, they had big boost in their earnings following the war, and their earnings continued to rise over their lifetime until retirement. The 1950s birth cohort, there was a big boost in productivity between the 1940s cohort and 1950s cohort. Again, creative destruction after the war, big productivity boom. And again, those people had a lifetime earnings increase until they retired. For the 1960s and the 1970s cohorts, however, what you can see is that there was a much less of a boost because productivity growth had stalled. And even more importantly, their earnings over their lifetime basically have already maxed out. even before retirement. And this is a consequence of stalled globalization and stalled productivity growth. So the inequalities that we see, rather than being a sort of a consequence of productivity growth and globalization, are a manifestation of a slowing of the productivity growth, slowing of the globalization, and slowing of the creative destruction pressures. So what we want to do is follow exactly those strategies that Philippe and his co-authors put out. Is we have to focus on the challenges associated with ensuring that the labor market and workers can get the benefits of these transformations, and that will push globalization back onto the front foot instead of the back foot, will push productivity growth back onto the front foot as opposed to the back foot. And through those changes will create that optimism that improvements in potential growth that Ayhan noted are needed in order to achieve the commitments that we have given over to our citizens. So with that, we can turn to discussion. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Catherine. We don't have a lot of time. So but all three panelists talked about growth prior to the pandemic. Catherine finished on talking about inequality and its links to productivity and globalization, and ensuring that everyone gets the benefits, as in fact it did Philippe talked about the need for a social safety net as well. But I actually want to start with a couple of questions that came from the audience that are, I think, related. One is, it really questioning the premise that growth is should be our objective. And one was really asking, how much should we encourage creative destruction? Considering that such activities appear to go against ESG, environmental, social, and governance concerns. And maybe a related one, does it make sense to still talk about growth in the developed world in the context of population decline and scarcity of resources? And is it, and at what cost to the environment? So let's start with those questions, because those are really questioning the premise, some of the premise that all of us brought in. So I'll turn it to everyone. So let's start with.
Can I start? Thank you very much. So first, wonderful discussion by Ayhan and Catherine. I took lots of notes, and great, you did a fantastic job. Really, many congrats to both of you. And I, of course, agree with all what you said. So on the environment, some people in France and elsewhere think that the way to fight global warming is to have negative growth. But we had a natural experiment, between March and May 2020, because of the first lockdown, French GDP went down by 35%. CO2 emissions went down by 8%. So, and if we wanted to just do negative growth, you would take a negative, to generate the desired reduction in CO2 emissions. But we know the damage that the first lockdown, we had to do it, but it had terrible damage, on the young, on the youth. The psychological damage was huge. On developing countries, the damage has been huge. Many people have died in developing countries, not directly from COVID, but from the slowdown induced by COVID. So that's the negative growth for you. Of course, I'm not obsessed by GDP only. I look at utils. We want to grow utils. We want to innovate. But I think the way out is green innovation. I think we need to innovate also in our habits. Of course, we have to be more careful when, with the trash, have more circularity, have more. So in our ways of saving on electricity, we have to change our habits. But at the same time, I think there is innovation makes it possible. The world is not finite when you have innovation. And there, of course, creative destruction helps you, because we know that firms that innovated dirty in the past tend to innovate dirty in the future. So, of course, new firms don't have that problem. So creative destruction by itself helps you. But we know that the state and the civil society, again, the triangle, can help redirect the technical change of firms towards clean technologies. Carbon tax, industrial policy, ARPA energy, the consumers, the name and shame, all those guys, competition, when you have the name and shame between firms. All those forces are very important in inducing faster green growth and faster inclusive growth. Voilà. That's about, I think, the way that I see that's my own way, my response to what I want to let my friends also respond. Thank you.
So
Yeah.
my comment on this is it's similar to what Philippe is saying. Growth is a simple metric. You know, GDP is not inclusive of everything. That's for sure. Yeah. When I was at the OECD, we talked about the Better Life Index. We can talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of those are measured, some of those are not. But we can incorporate many of those sort of unmeasured, important ingredients to better life. And we do that. When we're sitting here and talking about GDP, we're just using it as a shorthand. We're not saying it's all inclusive or that's the only metric. So I think that's the first observation to make. The second observation is transformation, innovation can get rid of the old stuff, the dirty stuff, the dangerous stuff, and replace it with better ways of working, better tools to work with, less, as Philippe said, trash. And so we're talking about transformation yields growth, and we measure it that way, but it's a better outcome for the citizens. We measure it as a positive growth rate, and because it is, but it's a better outcome. And I think that that's something that we have to keep in mind, that it is a better outcome. That's our goal, is to have a better outcome for the citizens that are the ones we have now, but also the ones of the future. And that's I think that's what we're talking about here.
Not much to add to what Philippe and Catherine said. One important point is the following. I think in advanced economies, when you have certain levels of income, it is much easier to entertain ideas, to say, maybe we don't need growth. We just need to save the climate. Even in advanced economies, that could be a self-defeating idea. As Philippe and Kat mentioned, the objective is not growth. Growth is just one metric. The GDP is one metric. Instead, the idea is that to have a different composition of growth that will translate into wealth without polluting the environment. But the bigger challenge is that there are countries that are not rich, that are indeed poor, and they need growth. And they did not really contribute much to the climate problems we are dealing with. So we just need to understand the consequences above and beyond this, the simple idea that, low growth or the negative growth can be a panacea. It could actually lead to all types of challenges in political sphere. It will lead to probably more populism, and it will lead to type of policies that will be counterproductive. So there are consequences of advancing these types of ideas. And those consequences go beyond the borders of advanced economies. Let me stop there.
Great, thanks. So we're running short, so I want to try to just turn to one topic. We're just thinking about growth after the pandemic, and as we look forward. Ayhan's figures were striking, and suggesting that emerging markets might well fall short over the next few years. And yet during the pandemic, of course, we've seen new innovations, new ways of doing business taking root, and we've seen the ability to do webinars like this. Now, some people have noted that following the 1918-19 flu, we got the roaring 1920s with strong growth. Now, Ayhan talked about some of the list of possible challenges and opportunities that could offset it. I know one that came up in a question was online learning, where many students lost a lot of educational ground, and many students around the world have very limited access to education. So that would be a downside. But is there any chance the pandemic will facilitate a break from the slow growth period we saw before the pandemic? Or could automation and artificial intelligence boost growth? And maybe a specific question for Philippe that came up in the question was, when you talk about a better capitalism that might make for a better future, what is the specific role of business in creating that better capitalism? So I don't know who wants to take that first.
I don't know. As you.
Yep. Philippe, why don't you take that
maybe
first?
Maybe why don't you ask me the. So the first question was, sorry, can you repeat the first the question?
Well, really, one question for you.
Oh,
is,
the competition. I now remember. So in fact, I mean, you see, it's interesting that in the US, COVID brought about Biden, and Biden has done competition reform. Now we'll see what happens, but for me, big part of the declining growth in the US has to do with the inappropriate competition policy. We did not adapt competition policy to digital era. That's what Richard Gilbert explains very well in his latest book. We also your competition policy in Europe is too much market share, market definition, not enough. When you do allow or not for merger acquisition, you don't factor in entry and innovation enough. So my feeling is that now we see that new competition, I don't know if it will go very far, but I think we've seen new competition reform in the US in the past 2 months, 2 months ago. So I put a lot of hopes on that. I think that's a good development. There might be other things also, maybe also on the taxation for forcing a minimum tax of 15% everywhere. That somehow weakens the GAFAM compared to other firms because they were the most benefiting from the very low tax in some, the tax havens were very much for them. So I hope that I don't know, this kind of reform that was made, that came after COVID. Another thing also is that the young, for example, in France, COVID was a revelator that we have to do more on innovation and industrial policy. Very interesting that now you have a new government in Germany. You have a finance minister from the Liberal Party. Usually the Liberal in Germany are terrible. They're ayatollahs. They always tell you red line, red line, red line. I haven't heard the word red line so far from him. So that's a revolution that you have a Liberal Party in Germany that doesn't use the word red line because we know we need to make big investments and we should not count growth enhancing investment the same way we count other type of spending. I think this idea is making progress. The package, the package that we got at European level would have been unthinkable. The idea of mutualizing debts, the mutualized debt in Europe, it was impossible to get Germany to agree with us on that. We made enormous progress because of COVID. So I have a feeling that COVID brought about an awareness that we need to do more on innovation, we need to do more on investment, we need to do more for the young, we need to have to use Maastricht, but implement Maastricht more smartly than we used to. My hope, and do more like what Draghi does in Italy, my hope is that COVID will lead to all those things that, will put us on the, but, I'm an optimistic. So I try to be, anyway. Yes.
So
okay, Catherine?
I want to bring up the issue of global engagement. It's a part of the book. There's only one chapter in there really on globalization, Philippe. I feel left out. I mean, I think from my examination of the data, the slowdown in global engagement, not just by advanced economies, but importantly, emerging markets have also really disengaged from the global economy for one reason or another. They have disengaged from each other. Tariffs still remain very high, barriers remain very high on emerging markets trade with each other. And so when we think about the competition problem, which I certainly agree, and it's not just about the IT companies, it's more broadly than that. The competition that can come from deeper global engagement, whether we're not talking about we can break up with China or not, but deeper global engagement across borders technology inflows and outflows, an essential ingredient to innovation, expansion of markets, the discipline that comes from meeting the market test, finding new ideas, finding new markets. This is something we are in retreat. We are in retreat, and policymakers are in retreat. And this is an essential component of an improved outcome from the creative destruction process. It's almost as if creative destruction is got one hand behind its back, because global engagement is not fully engaged in the process.
Yeah. So I think we're already a little over time. Ayhan, I don't know if you had any final words you wanted to say on that. Very, very in 15 or 30 seconds.
I think what's gonna, we hope to have these technological breakthroughs are becoming general purpose. More people using them, this facilitates even more aggressive creative destruction, and pandemic could be the trigger for that. We hope to have, faster growth because of innovations, higher productivity growth that was not happening prior to the pandemic. But with the pandemic, I think these technologies are becoming general purpose, used large masses, and they could have cumulative effects over time. And if that happens, and if the magic triangle Philippe mentioned, state provides the kind of the environment, firms do what they are supposed to do, and civil society facilitate, be a facilitator for change, maybe better days are ahead of us. But let me stop there with that optimistic view.
All right, thank you very much, and thank all three of you for the sweeping discussion of the big challenges and opportunities facing societies. I'm sorry we've run over. So to conclude, I want to thank our three panelists, and I especially want to thank all of you for attending. A couple of very quick final remarks. First, it would be great if you could fill out the Qualtrics survey in this webinar to give us your feedback. Second, you can stay in touch with INSEAD and stay in touch with us on INSEAD's lifelong learning LinkedIn page. And third, you can find replays of our seminars, of our webinars on the online digital library. Finally, please join us for the next lifelong learning webinars, starting with Leading Transformation in an Age of Disruption on Friday, October 29th. And there will also be a range of discussions as part of the SDG Sustainable Development Goals Week in early November. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great job.